This is TWiT.
Let's start with how social media was used kind of as a tool to stir up this insurrection that we all witnessed in real time online. I mean, obviously, social media is a tool that's been used for a lot of things over the past 4 years. What about this scenario specifically? How was it used?
So I think we're seeing two things. I think at one point we are seeing the creation and the impact of having an entirely new ecosystem of conservative and right-wing social media sites like Parler and the Donald website, which operates independently after Reddit banned the Donald subreddit, and also messaging communities like Telegram and WhatsApp, where right-wing and far-right folks are able to coordinate shared travel routes, let these like memes and messages and interpretations of Trump's comments kind of fester and grow. But you're also seeing that on traditional platforms, which have taken some like very until the last 24 hours, they've taken very small steps to moderating their own communities. There have been independent organizations that monitor, things like Q-related accounts, like the QAnon accounts on Twitter, and there are, more than 20,000 Q-related accounts operating on Twitter, and I think it was most of them had been talking about January 6th in the days prior. There were even small Facebook groups that were sharing travel routes and talking about January 6th in the days leading up. So I think a lot of the conversation about how to coordinate this event, attack, if you want to call it, riot, it's kind of a swirling mix of jargon right now. But these were very well coordinated, and a few thousand people don't show up in the same place by accident. So you're certainly seeing two halves of the social media sphere kind of intersect in real life, and I don't think that you can ignore either one.
And I mean, it's important also to mention, right? Like this was an event, like you said, that was planned. Just a meeting in D.C., right? The what is it? The Stop the Steal event. President Donald Trump speaking at the event, and I mean, it's interesting to go back and listen to some of the words, and then in the context of what happened. How did and then a little bit later, of course, Trump posted a video that I think on one hand was intended to kind of silence critics who were saying, hey, you're not doing something about this, stop it. But it really didn't have that desired effect, because many of the words that he chose were not necessarily encouraging people to stop it. So how did Twitter and Facebook respond when that video was posted? Did it take them a long time to react? I mean, I feel like we saw a different reaction to that video than we've seen these networks do in recent history.
Yeah, so the reaction over the course of December 6th, which was only yesterday, was much faster than we had basically ever seen before. The video that Trump posted to both Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, action was taken on Twitter under 5 minutes. And that action that Twitter took was in the form of a lock on the tweet and the eventual deletion of the tweet. That was not in 5 minutes. That took a longer amount of time. But what Twitter was doing initially was they would lock these tweets and put a little flag on them. What the lock meant is that you couldn't reply to the tweets, you couldn't favorite the tweets, and you couldn't retweet the tweets without commenting on them. So you couldn't just do like a blind retweet or however they want to style that, but you could quote tweet it, which was just as effective as a retweet in sharing it. And they still allowed the video to proliferate and get, I believe it was more than 12 million views before it was taken down. Facebook was a little bit more aggressive. They took the video down, and YouTube, I believe, was the first to take the video down. But Facebook and YouTube acted quicker than Twitter in this regard. So that was pretty fast action, and it was obvious that the companies had teams that were working on this and very quickly reviewing content from the accounts, and that escalated, as I'm sure if you pay attention to tech news, into bans on Twitter account of President Trump, as well as the ban of the Facebook account, and those have kind of came out in different ways. Twitter was a 12-hour ban that I believe was contingent on him deleting 3 of those posts, which have now been deleted, and ostensibly he can come back on the platform, although he hasn't yet, as far as I know, in the last 10 minutes, although things happen very quickly. And Mark Zuckerberg has released a statement saying that Trump will be banned from the platform for at least 14 days until the peaceful transfer of power takes place. So it was indefinitely, but definitely 14 days. So we'll see how that works. There are definitely incentives for Facebook at play to allow Trump, who generates a lot of engagement on the platform, back on. But it's, I guess, good that they did it now,
at all,
rather than at all. Yeah.
Right. Eventually. That's what really kind of struck me. Right. It's just this morning that Facebook made that announcement about the indefinite suspension of Trump's account. Twitter, we haven't really heard from as far as like a longer term reaction similar to Facebook's. I kind of wouldn't be surprised if Twitter ends up in that regard, too. But when I look at this, like, I can't help but feel like, I mean, yes, of course, the violence and everything that we saw in Washington, D.C., that's its own reason. But then we also have the official certification of President-elect Joe Biden, which in its own symbolic way ends up marking kind of the final stand, right? The final frontier that that maybe some people were waiting for, to say, okay, now there really is no turning back. There is no undoing this. This is happening. Do you think that had a cause or a direct correlation with them making such an aggressive stand with Facebook, taking them as an example to say, okay, well, there really is no undoing at this point. So now we can almost politically, for our social network and how people view our social network, we can draw this line in the sand. It's not as dangerous for us to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I totally think so. And they not only had the advantage of having the electoral vote certified, but they also had people from across the academic sphere, from across the political sphere, from across, the pundit sphere, calling for them to stop letting Trump post. Like it was not just that Facebook was doing this in a vacuum, and its own employees had been talking about what to do on its internal messaging boards. BuzzFeed News had reported that Facebook had actually quelled conversations internally about this very topic. So I think that was a bubbling culture inside the company, and they were really, I think that the writing was on the wall that this was something that the company couldn't let progress any further. And if they hadn't taken action, I think that history definitely would have been written as with Facebook's complicity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, it is interesting to me that, especially in the last year, it seemed like Twitter has been the social network to really come out and be like, you know what, we're kind of tired of this and kind of drawing a certain line in the sand of reaction, whereas Facebook has been really in many ways reluctant to do so. Yet yesterday and today, that seems to have kind of flip-flopped. What's your take on that? And like, do you feel like Twitter is likely to follow suit, or I guess we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, but why the flip-flop?
Well, I think if you look at the platforms as a whole, I would say that Twitter is much more reliant on the singular Trump figure as a platform, right? Like Twitter has been skyrocketed to new newsworthiness with having Trump on its platform, and it's I would imagine a very difficult business decision to boot him off permanently. Facebook, if you think about the ecosystem of right-wing media that exists, it's much less reliant on a singular Trump figure and more reliant on these right-wing news pages. It's Rush Limbaugh. It's Ben Shapiro. It's the entire ecosystem versus a singular figure, and that exists on Twitter to some extent. But it's really, Trump dominates Twitter, and Twitter's treatment of Trump has been basically they've carved out special exceptions for him, and because he's probably the world's most notorious politician, and because he generates a lot of engagement. And what they've done so far has been basically labeling them and saying, hey, maybe this isn't true. But truth be told, they haven't done more than a slap on the wrist. Obviously, I don't think that the Trump team likes having that, like, their facts have been disputed, but it's also more fuel to the fire for them to say, we're being censored. They don't like our version of the facts. And it's really not done much to stop Trump on Twitter. The last 24 hours have been pretty evident of that.
Yeah, indeed. Now, I saw a tweet from Edward Snowden a couple of hours ago saying, for better or for worse, this will be remembered as a turning point in the battle for control over digital speech. What's your take on that? Like, do you consider this to be a turning point?
I think about it slightly differently. I think that this is a kind of the grand experiment in deplatforming. I think that these platforms do not grant speech. I can talk to people. I can call my friends. I think that the platforms have an incredible role in amplifying speech. And I think what's really at stake here isn't necessarily the First Amendment, but the ability to the extent to which that the platforms enable you to have an audience. And I think that is a little bit more constructive to talk about into terms of deplatforming. And if you look at right-wing personalities like Alex Jones, who was like kind of notoriously deplatformed a year or so ago, I hope it was that like a year or so ago and not like 15 hours ago. But he yells through a bullhorn on the streets of Austin, Texas now. Like it has worked incredibly well for smaller conspiracy theorists to get them off the platform, to make their ideas more fringe, and to make the online ecosystems a relatively healthier place. Now, does that happen when a figure with as much gravity as Trump is expelled from the platforms? It's really an open question. This is kind of the experiment that the platforms are conducting right now. Can Trump break through somehow? He obviously might have the attention of the news network, so he can get around having a social media ban, and that anything that he says will be repeated on social media. But it doesn't seem to have happened yet. So we really don't know how effective this deplatforming has worked because there's really been no official communication. So what we're all trying to figure out now is what happens when Trump speaks, and can a politician really be deplatformed? Especially if they make some sort of legislative action, if there are executive orders signed, like that's news. That's going to be picked up and carried everywhere. So I think what we're really kind of bracing and waiting for something to happen. And until then, I don't think we really know what the impact is going to be.
One of the things that struck me yesterday was a little bit of fake news that had distributed that people quickly jumped on board with and believed, and the strange power that it had in not just folks that, like me, who are steeped in technology, but I now use my partner kind of as a touchstone, so to speak, or a gauge of the non-steeped in tech crowd. And his group chat with his friends were all talking about many of them believed that Vice President Michael Pence had unfollowed Donald Trump on Twitter. And, they see this little bit of news and then they picked it up and, we're running with it and he. But it's not just that, which was so easy. My partner told me that that's what someone had said. And so I immediately went to Donald Trump's Twitter account, or VP Pence's Twitter account, and looked and saw that he was still following Trump. And my partner shared that with his friends. And so then everybody was kind of aware of it. It wasn't just the idea that that was such a silly thing that could quickly and easily be proven to not be true. But just the idea that a one leader unfollowing another leader had this gesture that meant something politically. And so I'd love for you, just what do you see as the not only the role of these social media companies, but the, at this point, power of these social media companies in shaping kind of political discourse, but also just sort of the political landscape? I mean, do you feel like we have to continue to watch these companies and be aware of how it increases or decreases power, or is it just kind of it maybe doesn't have as much power as we like to think it does, or that, you know, people give it? Do you think that these companies and the idea of social media has a lot of power, or is it just something that we've sort of built up and it could quickly be taken away?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and there's more than one form of power, right? There's institutional power. There's social power. There's power to either make things happen in the real world or to make people believe things that they in turn will do. I think that social media has proven that the power to influence people and exert your power on others is something that can ripple and fester and create events like we saw yesterday. So I think that it would be dangerous to understate the power that social media has, but I would be remiss to conflate it with someone like Donald Trump's political power, which is the ability to sign an executive order or to instruct the military or do or take actions that that have like really serious real life consequences. So while following and unfollowing Vice President Pence is a indicator of how the relationships of power might be playing out in the White House, I don't know if it's necessarily something that we can look at besides, you know, courtroom drama. To mix metaphors, but I think that social media certainly has its own power, and it is a direct line of communication with constituents, right? So I think it's really balancing the two kinds of power that politicians really have, and it really just makes things faster. It makes them more effective, and it makes the ability to talk to constituents and people that will carry out kind of your wishes much more effective.